So I'm Laura Sutherland. I run my own consultancy, Aura, focusing on stakeholder engagement. And I'm pleased to be working with the PRCA and its strategy group, which also includes Chair John Brown, Corey, as you can see here, Tila from Intent Health, David Gallagher, Omnicom Group, and Simon from Campaign Collective. And we set out to basically understand the current level of knowledge and also to find out how many PR and communication professionals are actually advising clients around climate change, purpose, and all that sort of wider discussion. And also to find out what people really thought about our roles as strategic advisors. So we're leading a very positive initiative, highly practical as well, which is really important. We talk about moving from intent actually to action, and that's something we want to keep on underlining. If everyone could today please use the Q&A box for any questions, that would be good, because it just keeps lets us keep track of questions and answers. If you want to use the chat box to talk to each other, that's fine. Share your handles, etc. Introduce yourselves, no problem at all. We're all here for the chat this afternoon. And also to point out that we are recording this session because we want to make it publicly available afterwards. So just to flag that to anybody who might be writing or saying anything. But today we're very pleased to be launching the results of the research that we conducted with our industry partner Opinium. And here to talk to us about the results is research manager Sophie Holland from Opinion. And I'm going to hand over to you just now, just to quickly run through that before we head into the panel.
Great. So yeah, lovely to be speaking to you all today. Launched the research. We were delighted to partner with PRCA and the strategic group on this important topic. So I'm from Opinion. We're a global strategic insight agency based in London, offices in New York as well. Started those in the, we launched it in the start of the pandemic, so that was all fun and games. And yeah, I'm really excited to kind of set the scene ahead of our panel discussion in a moment. So just before we get stuck into the results, I guess it just helps maybe if I kind of summarise a little bit about what we did and who we spoke to. So there's two separate surveys that we ran. We ran a consumer survey with 2,000 nationally representative UK adults on our consumer omnibus, and that was kind of mid-February. And then we also ran an industry survey sent out by PRCA to the PR and communications industry, and we received back 180 results. So thank you very much if you completed that survey. We really appreciate it, because it wouldn't be possible to kind of do this sort of analysis without people responding to these types of surveys. And that took place mid-February to mid-March. So I'm just going to run you first through some of the key findings from the consumer survey, and then through some of the key findings from the industry survey. So kicking off with the consumer findings, I guess it's unsurprising when we kind of look at, overall levels of concern around the climate crisis. 46% of consumers are saying that they're highly concerned about this. And when I say highly concerned, we ask people to rate on a 10-point scale how concerned they were, and these are the people who said 8 to 10. And I guess looking more interestingly at some of the attitudes around, the climate crisis and who needs to act, 3/4 of the UK population feeling that actually businesses need to be taking more action in tackling the climate crisis, and feeling that, we're not making progress on this issue quickly enough. But I think it's also quite interesting that we've got half of the population here feeling that actually it's up to government to take the lead on this issue, and not individuals. And I think there's a lot of confusion around how individuals can act and their role in this debate and in, solving this issue. And so we also wanted to understand, okay, we're talking about businesses taking more action. So which industries are currently, doing well in this and actually are, helping solve the climate crisis? And which industries might be doing the least? So we asked people to tell us their top 3 industries that they thought were leading the way, and top 3 that they thought were doing the least. So on the left-hand side, we can see that the energy industry, by quite a long way actually, is really leading in terms of being seen as leading the way in solving this issue. And then we also have a lot of other kind of innovative industries in there as well, the technology industry, the engineering industry too. Then when we look at the industries doing the least, actually, what I find quite interesting here, and I guess not so much when we've done some research separately into fashion sustainability and the impacts of fast fashion, but the fashion industry comes out top in terms of doing the least. So 1/4 of the UK population thinking that industry is doing the least. That's actually ahead of kind of travel and transport as well. So we want to also understand, where do people hear about climate crisis information? I think this kind of makes sense. Most people hearing about it on the TV documentaries. We've all watched the David Attenborough, and then newspapers, websites, kind of print, and then social media, particularly putting that one out, as we're going to go into that a little bit deeper in a moment. But 29% of people are hearing about climate crisis information via that medium. So how much do people actually trust the sources of information that they're receiving climate crisis information through? And this chart is in the same order as the previous one, but this is showing levels of trust in the different mediums. And actually, I think the most stark one, the one I've pulled out here, is social media. It's probably unsurprisingly the least trusted source of information, with only 27% of people actually saying that they trust the information they get about the climate crisis via social media. And thinking more about misinformation, we want to delve a bit deeper into, okay, when people are actually accessing information via social media about the climate crisis, how accurate is this information that they're getting? So we presented people with the question you can see here in dark blue. And basically, we were asking people, in the past month, do they recall seeing a news story on the climate crisis on social media that was one of these four things, or none of them? And these are all kind of forms of misinformation and disinformation. And that's actually 47% of social media users have actually been misinformed or disinformed on social media about the climate crisis in the past month as well. And I think you really understand the scale of this issue when you then look at how many people this is in the UK. And that's 21.8 million UK adults have actually been exposed to this misinformation about the climate crisis via social media in the last month. And that's not even really, that's all adults, so that's all 18 plus. This isn't taking into account actually, younger people who might also be on social media, are on social media more, I say might be, are on social media more, that's not even taking into account that. So I think the scale of the issue is really highlighted here. So that's going to highlight, the scale of the issue and, what are consumers thinking and feeling and doing. And so now we're going to the industry findings from the PR and communication survey. So in terms of advising clients about this topic and about the climate crisis, it is something that PR and comms professionals are currently doing, with 72% saying that they do it to some degree. So we ask this on a scale, whether it's a few clients that you're advising or every client that you're advising, or the organisation that you work in if you are in-house. And so that's quite a lot of people. And actually what's even more interesting is when we look at how has this grown over the last 5 years. So what we see is that actually 70% are saying that they are advising clients and organisations more on the climate crisis than they were 5 years ago. And so a real growth in, appetite for advice in this area. And what I also wanted to include in here was a little bit about what the PR and communications professionals see their clients doing or their organisation doing if they're in-house, in terms of, taking action on the climate crisis. And what we see is actually, the top kind of ones here, 67% saying that their clients have sustainability policies and practices in place, carbon footprint reduction measures. So it's shown by 63%. Then also, actually their clients actually contributing to debates and discussions on climate change as well. There's also these mentions of, these net zero commitments and carbon offsetting and things like this as well that people are seen to be doing. One of the quite stark things actually, and I've highlighted at the bottom, is actually 1 in 10 say that they aren't aware of their clients taking any action at all. So it might be that they're just not aware of it, but it's even more worrying, if they're not actually taking any action on this issue altogether. So kind of coming back to this issue of taking action and getting involved with discussions on the climate crisis topic. I think there's an issue around bandwagoning here with lots of PR and comms professionals saying actually I do see my clients saying they want to jump on the bandwagon of talking about climate change, but they're not actually doing anything about it. So that's reported by 60% of the people that we surveyed. But there's also an issue around feeling the need to be an expert on this topic to be able to contribute. So 2 in 5 saying that actually, you know, I feel like my client needs to be like an actual expert on this topic to be able to contribute to the climate crisis debate themselves. And I think there's also this undertone of nervousness as well around clients and organisations getting involved in this debate, which is reported there by 18%. And so we're kind of at the end of just kind of the summary of the results. I just wanted to kind of leave you guys with this stat. Actually 78% of the PR and comms community actually that we surveyed. So the industry does need to do more to tackle misinformation around the climate crisis. It's an area people want to see the industry focus on, and an area that could really the industry can help accelerate change in immensely. And it was great to see that the strategic group are kind of doing these sort of things and acting on this, and it's great to see the industry behind that. So that brings the end of my my presentation. So I'll hand back to Laura to introduce the panel members.
Thank you, Sophie. That was I hope everyone's G'd up now that they've had a look at the research results, and also hearing it from Sophie as well, and just a sort of interpretation of it is also useful to sort of understand where the stats have come from in a little bit more detail. And also, you can't argue with 78% of colleagues in the industry saying that they actually think we need to be taking more action and progressing in that area. So it's really encouraging. So thank you for that presentation. Now I'd like to introduce the expert panel we have to have a wider discussion around how we will approach our work and things to consider as well. So welcome to Liberty Bollen, who's Head of Marketing at Compare Your Footprint, Dave Britton, Associate Director of Communication Engagement at Met Office, and Ipsita Bhatia, Partnerships Manager at Count Us In. Welcome. Remember and put yourself off mute. Just a reminder, as I didn't do that earlier on. Do you want to very quickly, Liberty, start off just by telling us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm responsible for the marketing for Compare Your Footprint. It's an online carbon calculation and benchmarking tool. It was set up by Green Element, which is an environmental management consultancy. And it was set up with the aim of empowering organisations to be able to measure and monitor their own carbon footprint. So just briefly, my background comes from private equity and impact investment through to campaigning for the rights of tribal peoples and creating an online academy for Extinction Rebellion. But I wanted to be part of the solution, not the protest, and believe business has the power to make significant change to reduce the consequences of climate change. So I'm delighted to be here. Chat to you all.
Brilliant, thank you. And Ipsita?
Thanks so much, Laura, and great to be here with everyone. My name is Ipsita, or Ipsy, and I'm a partnership manager at Count Us In. Count Us In is a 10-year campaign that aims to inspire 1 billion people to take practical steps to reduce their own carbon pollution in the next 10 years. And it very much recognizes that the climate crisis is here and it's real, but each of us have the ability and power to do something about it. And what Count Us In does is that when you take a step on the platform, is that it aggregates all the action that people take. So it really shows that every individual can take action, and not only that, but you can see kind of the impact that that action has on our global aggregator. And so it's really empowering and, again, inspiring people to say that the things that we can do together as a collective are really, really meaningful, and that can then further inspire even more bold systemic change. I'm happy to share more in a little bit, but that's a little gist.
Thank you. And Dave?
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and yeah, delighted to be here. So yeah, my name's Dave Britton. Work at the Met Office is as the National Meteorological and Climate Service for the UK. We're the home of the Met Office Hadley Centre, one of the world's leading climate research and climate science research institutes. Here in Exeter, we probably have one of the largest concentration of climate science world-leading expertise in terms of number of people that are involved as either contributing or lead authors of the International Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Our work is really around engaging audiences, so they really are aware and understand and are able to act on the climate science information that is available. And we're really thinking about this space around misinformation and disinformation, is making sure that we really clearly, accurately provide the climate science evidence on which communications should be made, and therefore to inform both policy decisions and communications decisions, whether that's in with the public, for the government, or for industry.
Great, thanks, Dave. I'm sure you'll agree that with such a widespread interest, variety of experience and skills, this is definitely the panel to be speaking to today about this. So I'm just going to get stuck right in with some questions that we have prepared, mainly so we can start to flesh out how we can be transparent in what we do, and so that we also can be more collaborative in our approach. And it'd be great to hear your thoughts individually. The first question is, how do we ensure that the work that we do as communication professionals translates into action and not fear? Liberty, you mentioned something when you were doing your introduction, that you wanted to take those sort of positive steps, and you wanted that to be a positive impact. Do you maybe want to kind of tell us a little bit about how we as communication professionals should be thinking about doing that?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's looking at the practical actions and solutions. I think when we see the headlines, we see climate emergency, climate crisis, and it just feels too big for people, individuals, businesses to solve. And transitioning to low carbon ways of working for businesses can be really hard for the likes of construction in companies, for example, that have complex infrastructure and supply chains and heavily reliant on resources. And I think companies are also worried about getting hauled over the media coals over not getting it quite right. The Advertising Standards Authority have exposed a few organisations for, wrong claims, environmental claims. So I think it would be great to maybe move the focus away on what we aren't doing right and show what the industry is doing right, and really highlight, even just the small changes businesses are making, particularly in the more difficult industries. I know in the research, construction was perceived as being a big problem, but there's a lot of companies doing so much to change their ways, from changing, diesel generators to ones that run off of vegetable oil, for example, which reduces the carbon emissions by 90%, so that they're using, more renewable energy on site. That kind of thing really needs to be communicated. So I think, taking away the fear of not knowing what to do as a company, and being shown some solutions. And it's okay to just show the small steps. I've carbon footprinted, I know my baseline, and I know I now need to set some targets, rather than going, right, I'm committing to net zero, and you think, well, what does that really mean, in the broader scheme of things? So
you make a really important point there, though, about actually taking your carbon footprint for that measurement, because unless you know where you're starting, how do you know what your goals are going to be and where you're aim to, to be? And that's where the fear potentially comes from, where people are starting out to go on a journey, but actually they don't have any benchmark as to where they've come from and where they're going.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, and I wanted to actually highlight Ipsita's amazing Count Us In and the 16 steps, the actions that you can take. And actually you look through them, and most people can do the majority of them. And we do the same. We've got 10 actions that a business can take to reduce their carbon emissions. And the first one is changing your electricity provider to 100% renewable, which can reduce your carbon emissions for electricity to 0. And it's brilliant. So yeah, just the carbon footprint alone, as you were saying, Laura, can just be a great step to announce.
And Ipsy, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about that then? Because that seems like a really nice, kind of practical way to tell us about how we can take steps.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think just to really quickly add as well, I think often what a lot of messaging really tells us is like, this is where we need to be in, 10 years time, 20 years time, 14 years time. And it feels really overwhelming. And it's just people don't know where to start. And I think that's the key, is about like, what are the small things that everyone can do on a day-to-day basis, and where do you start? And also kind of really not turning it into virtue signaling. It's actually more about celebrating and saying that this is what I'm trying to do, or this is kind of where I might start. So it's not saying like, yes, we all need to turn vegans and stop eating a certain way, because that can feel really overwhelming to people and target them. And I really feel like they're doing something wrong. And that's not what we're trying to say here. It's really about starting with small steps. And so as you'll see on the Countersin platform, for example, we've broken it down into kind of 4 little buckets around diet, transportation, lifestyle, and also voice, because voice is extremely important. And just the conversations that you have every day with your colleagues, or whether you're trying to talk to your politicians, talking to friends, that's extremely important in this conversation as well. And again, like I said, a lot of those things really ask you, like, where are you right now and where are you trying to be? And it's not trying to say that you're going to transform just turn a full 360 in a day's time or a week's time. It gives you 2 months to try something out, to see where you can go. And again, it's about having that, it's trying to really empower people and make sure that you're not really turning this into like, oh my gosh, I need to do this. And, everyone's like wide-eyed and terrified about the climate crisis, but rather something that we can all do. And again, I think with the platform, we've tried to create something fun and engaging and something that like resonates with people. Tried to keep the information quite limited and also like relevant to a global audience, that of course encourages people to go places afterwards to keep reading more, but as a starting point, bite-sized.
Yeah. And it was in the PRCA International Summit, I did a session with Dr. Martin Valenti, a former client of mine, about climate crisis to opportunity. And it was about looking at those, I suppose, looking at it from like an entrepreneur's perspective, thinking about how can we turn things around? How can we make things more exciting? How can we be more curious and learn more? Because curiosity is where you start to learn, evolve your own thoughts, and you start reaching out into different areas because you go down a rabbit hole essentially as well. And I think that's where, the platforms like Countersin can really help steer people to take those initial steps and to start to understand that. It does come back down to education, doesn't it? Educate ourselves first so that we kind of understand and that we don't feel overwhelmed by it all, I would say.
I'd agree with you, Laura. Is it okay to come in? I think it's really clear that the science is clear. Our climate is changing. We've already seen changes in our climate. The world has already warmed 1.1 degrees since the Industrial Revolution, and we're locked into some further warming. But that doesn't mean that it has to be scary. What we need to think about is what can we do to limit further warming in our climate, and therefore reduce the changes we may see in the future, but also recognize that we're going to see some of those changes already. So actually, whilst some of the conversations we had so far have largely been in the mitigation space, what can we do in the adaptation space? So what can we do to drive greater resilience? What can we do to build resilience for communities, whether here in the UK or around the world? And what are the things that we might see in the future that we really do need to be prepared for? And some of those can be quite big and some of those can be quite small. I think it's really important to recognize that probably for many people, and especially when it comes to communications, that we won't experience climate change as its sense. We'll experience the changes to our weather, or for some, shortages of water or drought or severe or changing rainfall patterns. That's what we'll experience. So what are the things that we need to do? What are the measures we need to be putting in place now or into the future to build more resilient communities, to build more resilient societies? So for example, some of the Met Office has been working with a number of nations in East Africa, for example, around building and strengthening national severe weather warning systems so that we can provide better warning of severe weather, because the instances for weather are becoming more frequent due to climate change, and that can ultimately protect people. That doesn't have to be terrifying, that doesn't have to be scary, but it's really important that we are warning people at times of severe weather. We're also working with the energy industry, for example, about making sure that our energy transmission networks are protected for the future. So it's not about saying that, oh, we're not going to have or at risk of losing electricity supply. Actually, it's making sure we're working with our energy transmission colleagues to build a resilient energy transmission system for the future, making sure that flood defenses are in place, and making sure that transformers are able to cope with warm days and warm nights and not get the necessary cooling that they need. And it's really important that we think about all of those things going forward.
Dave, you make such an interesting point around the resilience and adaptation, because, you know, as our roles as strategic advisors, we're not there just to communicate. We're not there just to write down words. We have to look at scenario planning, risk assessments, and work alongside leadership teams to develop that. And I think one of the things that we started off as in the strategy group talking about was coming away from just being that function of rolling stuff out to actually, if we're saying that we're strategic advisors, how can we be advising on the climate crisis and working with leadership teams to all-encompassing look at organisations, 360-degree views on just everything you were saying around what's the impact on societies, what's the impact on jobs and the economy, what's the impact on everything around us. And that's where those, you know, when we normally do, you know, crisis communication beforehand, we've done our risk assessments and our scenario planning, and it's just the same, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it will change the range of services that organisations need to provide in the future. It will change how we engage with our customers or users or stakeholders in lots of different ways. It will shape all of the interactions we have with the future, and making sure we're providing you know, services for the future, or even the types of things we are producing in the future. And I think it's really important. I suppose I'm very lucky that I work in an organisation where I've got 400, 500 scientists who are able to back me up with the facts and in complete detail to the nth degree. And I think that's really useful, but it's also that role of making sure that's understandable, it is translatable, and can be made real for people, so it can be understood. I think it's sometimes making sure it's clear that we favour the simplicity of the complexity, and very often within climate science, we are dealing in shades of grey. We don't have all the facts for the future. Whilst we are setting out projections, there's a lot of uncertainty in that in terms of what might happen with future emissions, or what might, you know, whether we see further reductions. And therefore we are dealing with shades of grey, and that can very often be very difficult to communicate.
Yeah. There's one last thing that we wanted to include within our launch day and our research, and that was a call for content, which we've all actually talked about in some way, shape or form so far. And that's because, you know, one of the best ways that we can learn from each other is by sharing. And if we can share best practice, if we can share experiences, if we can share what's worked and what's not worked, if we can share, you know, guides, skills, and things like that, and we can work together, then we can absolutely move further forward in a lot quicker pace as well. So one of the things that we would like to do is to ask people who are working in this area, or who are working with clients or in organisations, to submit content, which will really help what we're working towards. And if you're not sure what that content might be, then you can you know, chat to Corai, who'll be masterfully coordinating. But yeah, we just wanted to put that out there because it's so important that we can all work towards the same thing. And this will be hosted on a website which we're soon to launch, which kind of puts me into the next phase of questions. how do we then, or how can we then, in your experience, ensure that the quality of the stories and the case studies that we're collecting is of high quality, best practice? What are the sort of things we should be looking for? And it kind of goes back into the organisations as well. What should they be looking for when they're collecting their own case studies and talking positively about their own achievements? Liberty, do you want to, Byron?
Sure. So, because there's such a high percentage of PR people from your survey who work with clients that are addressing climate change, I thought, well, I wonder how many, it'd be really interesting actually to know from the audience today, how many would attend a meeting with their client's environmental management consultancy to really dig into the results. Because most organisations now will be using a consultant, or they'll have an in-house sustainability person. That person will be responsible for measuring the carbon footprint, potentially setting science-based targets, and creating a reduction strategy, and putting in sustainability policies, all of that. And I think if you're right at the forefront with them on when they receive that report from their consultants, if the consultants are good, they will be able to advise that organisation and you as a PR firm what you should be saying from that reporting, what's real, basically, rather than going out and saying I've committed to net zero by without really understanding what net zero really means. I think by understanding the sustainability strategy from the consultants themselves, when you're with your client, that would be, for me, the best way to get all the information you need to then lead your client in the right direction when they want to communicate about it.
So again, that's coming back to that seat at the table, talking and discussing together as a team, for that full understanding and that overall perspective. Yeah. Ipsy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say stuff around the UN is a great place to source information, and I think that that's also what we do, is working with scientists not only at the UN but at other places as well. And for me, as I studied development and sustainable development as a master's student, so I of course, took a lot from my university studies, but at the same time, I did a lot of work on the ground. And I think those kind of case studies around what type of impact climate change is having on a very real level and kind of local level was extremely important for me, because there are different communities who are experiencing climate change in various ways. And I think bringing those examples back to wherever you need to be, whether it's your clients or just even understanding it for yourself as an individual, is extremely important.
Yeah. Sophie, you've got your hand up. Oh, no. She didn't mean it. Thought you wanted to pitch in there.
Clearly I don't use Zoom very often, apologies.
No problem. Yes, exactly. And that's the thing, it's perspective, isn't it? It's everything in perspective, whether it's small micro scale or whether it's large corporations that are global, but understanding those organizations, even just like, Liberty was mentioning things like learning terminology, like don't talk about things you don't know about, go and educate yourself first before you start to talk about things. But there are, and I'm hoping that this is demonstrating to people who are perhaps on here and who are early sort of listeners to what the climate crisis is and what our involvement is, that there's actually organisations out there that can help and that can help educate, and this is one part of what we're trying to do. But equally, it's also important to, I suppose, just reinforce that this strategy group and what we're trying to do is talk about helping tackle misinformation and the climate crisis. Therefore, by us talking about how we can ensure best practice, how we can ensure that the quality of the case studies we're collecting is from a data perspective and a correct information perspective, so that we can share good quality content with people. I know there were a couple of comments there, and there have been previously about wider subjects like lobbying, but that's not something that we're tackling just now. Dave, have you got anything to add in about that?
I thought Ipsy's comments were really interesting. I think that listening to local communities and bringing those to life as stories about how climate change is real in people's lives, I think is really useful. I think from our perspective, you know, when there is here in the UK, when there's a heat wave or a piece of flooding or snow or whatever it might be, actually demonstrating how the likelihood of that has been changed because of our changing climate, I think is a really strong way of communicating the impacts that we're going to see. I think in more specific around the first part of your question, I think this again touches on Ipsy's point around the UN. I think in terms of where should you go for the right information, I think it's looking out for organizations that are providing impartial information, so that can be trusted, and similarly to I hope many of us are doing when we're reading social content or reading the internet, that we're verifying our sources all the time and making sure that our sources are verified back to organizations that I believe are demonstrating an impartiality, that where the analysis backed up by robust, in our case, scientific evidence that is backed up by the best science that is available at that time. And I think it's that where you'll find the information that you can really trust.
Yeah, definitely. Verifying is absolutely 100%, you know, what we should be doing across everything that we do, but particularly in this case, when, as you say, the variants are, and it will be a movable feast for, you know, the foreseeable future, and longer than that as well. So, you know, verifying and having that source and the source of truth is essential. But one thing that we're conscious of in society, as much as we are in public relations and communication as an industry, to the organisations that we're working in and that the organisations are representing its publics, how do we ensure that we bring diverse voices and ensure representation? Particularly as we're talking about potentially, talking to communities and being in communities and having conversations and engagement. Ipsy, that's something obviously you were talking about particularly the community aspect of it. How can we ensure that those diverse voices are actually being represented in these conversations that we're having?
It's a really complicated question. But I mean, I personally kind of think of it as, when you think of something like government, I instead think of something called governance. So when you think about the climate crisis as something that affects all of us, and who are the voices that you need to hear. And yes, of course, there's government, and yes, of course, there's business, and every single person in between. All the way from schools to universities to faith groups to sports teams to families and medical professionals. And how do you kind of create some sort of space that everyone can join in and have a productive, constructive conversation that more than anything, I think just allows for listening. That to me is key. So I think almost like in answering this question, it's really about like the soft skills that are involved, and really kind of allowing for a very kind of inclusive conversation that is compassionate and empathetic. Where there's not one person or one group that is less important or less valued than another.
And that, when we do stakeholder mapping and when we kind of profile our stakeholders and we work all that out at the very, very beginning of the work that we do, I think that is an intrinsic part of looking at, you know, where are the gaps, and it's understanding how we can go and find, why are we missing those gaps, as well, how is it we can miss gaps and whole communities or teams or people in the community that need represented. And it's, you know, as you say, it's complicated, but Liberty or Dave, have you got anything you'd like to add to potentially where you've had experience in these areas before?
Or Dave?
Thank you. I would just say I think it's really important to recognise that climate change won't affect us all equally, and therefore it's really important that we understand how climate change might, and therefore what we can do to address climate change either through mitigation or adaptation will vary, and be as diverse as diversity is. And I think that's really important to recognise that as we are communicating with our publics, as we're communicating with our stakeholders, that how we share the information around the challenges of climate change and the climate science and the impacts it might have, that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. And therefore, absolutely listening to our audiences, and it goes back to the point that both Ipsita and I made in the last question, actually making sure that we're listening to our audiences and understanding the stories and the impacts that are most relevant to them is so key in actually driving action in this space.
Yeah, 100%, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to make a point about COP26 actually. A while ago, I think we all were aware that there was a citizens' assembly set up to advise the government on climate change, made up of people of all walks of life. And I kind of did a little bit of scrambling around and I couldn't really see them represented at COP26. It's very heavily academic and elite, lots of leaders and sponsors and whatnot. And I do think that we need like equal representation of the civilian population to the academic and elite. And I think, you know, the scientists lead the way in terms of the knowledge and the impact, but equally we're all affected, particularly in the global south. And if we look at offsetting, for example, there's some great projects, but there's also projects where the local people are not consulted and there's land grabs. And because there's money to be made in offsetting emissions that actually, quite frankly, a lot of organisations could reduce. So I think there's a lot of people that have missed out of communication. So for example, if an organisation is going to talk about how they are going to reach net zero and they are talking about, say, a carbon offset project, then why not include the voice of the communities that are hopefully benefiting from that offsetting project? And then you get the full story.
And I think I would just add to that, Liberty, the importance of remembering the ethics in this space. So the ethical nature of offsetting or other practices that you might use to mitigate or adapt to climate change, whether that's geoengineering or so I think it's really important as PRs to make sure that we're representing that ethical practice back into our organizations, back to our clients, to recognize that not all adaptation or mitigation measures are equal, and to help inform some of those decisions as strategic advisors to our boards.
You raise a huge point there about ethics.
There's a whole separate conversation. I'd make one more point about COP26 and the Paris Agreement, and I think this goes back to climate change not all impacting us equal. So obviously the Paris Agreement says that we'll try and limit climate change to 1.5 degrees and we'll keep it well below 2 degrees, but that's the global average temperature. So that probably means that whilst here in the UK we might see 1.5 degrees, it could mean something completely different in other parts of the world. So certainly in more polar regions, that warming will be much more substantial and have greater impact. And similarly, as you pointed out, Liberty, the global south, small island developing nations, I think will be clearly more significantly impacted by climate change than others. And I think that's where this balance of understanding that 1.5 degrees is not, 1.5 degrees everywhere around the world. It's quite significant warming in some places of 4 or 5 degrees.
Yeah. And there's, we talk about, the ethics of data and use of data, and whether it's going out or whether it's coming back into organisations. But we've talked about the sort of quality of case studies and best practice for how we can ensure what we're collecting in and reading, etc., is of correct origin and verified at the same time. Are there any other resources around climate change which you would recommend for practitioners to go and read, look at, follow, even anything, if it's blogs, podcasts, things like that are verified, and that, we talked about the UN, obviously, being a huge source, but anything else that you would like to add to that sort of ongoing list?
Well, I think we'll be in touch with Dave. Knows his stuff, so everyone should be in touch with Dave.
Dave on speed dial.
The fat phone. I actually went out to our environmental management consultants to ask their advice, because they know better than me. And so they recommended, I'm sorry, I should remember these things. The IPCC, I think we mentioned the UN, there's lots of acronyms, UNFCCC, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, the Climate Justice Alliance. So again, going back to the representation piece, because it's easy to forget people at the end of the day. Carbon Market Watch is very good. And can't praise them enough, the Science Based Targets Initiative. Are absolutely brilliant. They were set up from a consortium of, again, loads of acronyms: WRI, UNGC, WWF, which we all know, CDP, and We Mean Business. So I urge you all to have a look at the Science Based Targets Initiative.
Perfect, thank you. We've got time for probably 1 or 2 questions. There were a couple of questions that have come in. I think some of them have been answered already, and a couple of them are out with our remit of the group, so we won't be responding to them. But obviously, if we run over and you have any further questions, then obviously please do get in touch, and we'll be happy to help with anything else. There's the Q&A box is still open if you want to add anything, anyone that's attending. Panelists, thank you so much. Is there anything you would like to finish with as your call to action to people from your perspective and experience?
Oh, wow.
Go for it, Liberty.
You've got to say something really profound now.
Is there anything you've learned? I mean, from my perspective, over years of working with climate change organisations and sustainability and in businesses and organisations, I've learned about collaboration being one of the biggest assets that we can have, because sharing, learning, collaborating with each other it speeds everything up. Things like, working alongside all parts of society, whether it's government, whether it's civic society, whether it's businesses, organisations, third sector, private sector, and bringing them all together and having a united conversation is also really important, because then you're all talking from the same hymn sheet, and you're all verifying each other essentially as well, and holding each other to account. And when we talk about misinformation, we've already talked in our group about how we will hold people account, or how we will actually call out organisations or people who aren't actually doing what they say they're doing, because people are banding about terms that they're actually not necessarily sticking to, they're not necessarily reporting on. And I think that's one of the things that we keep coming back to. If you say you're going to do something, you have to report on it. Yeah, maybe that's one thing you'd like to finish with then, in terms of reporting. What are the things that people should be looking out for in their reporting after they've done their benchmarking, obviously?
Yeah, that was great to point all of that out, Laura. You're right on the collaboration. Industries should come together and not compete. And I think, yeah, we offer benchmarking because it is helpful for companies to see how well they're doing in their own industry. So yeah, we offer that as part of our kind of online carbon calculation. I think, yeah, accountability is really important. So just, I'd say, particularly for organisations and all the clients of people that are on this discussion at the moment, is just encourage them to tell the truth. Don't jump on a bandwagon. It's just not worth it. Down the line, the reputational damage will be huge. There's going to be more regulation out there. There'll be more scrutiny. You only have to go and put an advert on to see some product is talking about its carbon footprint. So I think we just need to see times are changing. You can't hide everything anymore, and it will come out the woodwork. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Ipsy?
I feel like, so I can't answer too much on like the benchmarking stuff, but I feel like for me in the last year, as I've been working on Countersin, I feel like my own kind of mindset has changed a lot on how to approach climate issues. So I think similar to what you were saying, Laura and Liberty, collaboration is 100% key. Really kind of going into conversations with a positive, open, but also realistic kind of perspective is extremely important. And as much as, you know, we know where we are now and where we need to be, I think in the middle, there's all this space for innovation and creativity and just like allowing ourselves to be inspired and open to what comes our way. Of course, there's going to be, you know, challenges and things along the way, but I think it's just about the mindset and the approach with which we start and put our foot in.
Yep.
I just touch on David's question in the around how do industry influence government, just very briefly, and say that and you may expect me to say this because I'm a civil servant, but government, I think, is doing a good job in this space to some degree. I think, you know, the UK's presidency of COP26, the work they're doing, you know, with David Attenborough over recent weeks, the Together for Our Planet campaign, as well as both in terms of how they influence business and that transition to a low carbon economy and a greening of our economy, and certainly as part of the Build Back Better initiatives that government are putting together. I think we are in a strong place with government, but it is still our responsibility as the PR industry to making sure that we do support government in that way. And for me, that is about giving them the evidence that they need, making sure that they have the science to inform policy making, and making sure that the policies they're putting in place are very clearly evidence-based. So it's not about lobbying, but it is about making sure that they have the evidence they need to make the right decisions. Then more specifically on your point, I think this comes back, you know, goes back to my initial point around, you know, the science is clear, our climate is changing, and what we need to do is think right now about how we get ready for tomorrow. You know, what are the things we need to be doing, both ourselves as the industry, but also how are we supporting our clients or organizations to be best fit for the future.
And that is a beautiful ending. Thank you very much. Some great questions there came in, or some positive sort of conversation happening in the chat box there. I don't think I have missed anything I think that's all been taken. So thank you for attending, everybody, for coming along. Thank you to Sophie for the amazing work that Opinium have done with us, and for her time, obviously, to present the research. And thank you to Liberty, Ipsy and Dave for being brilliant panelists and having such great solid advice for people. And obviously this sort of conversation comes from a passion as much as it does experience, and that really shows, I think, when you have proper conversations around this. So it's been really fantastic to have you. Just a reminder as well, I mentioned that we were on the hunt for some content. So blogs, case studies, whatever it might be, please do get in touch if you need to check what it is that we're looking for, or if you have an idea you want to collaborate on, that would be fantastic. But that concludes our launch, and all it leaves me to say is thank you again for attending, and we hope to keep the conversation going. That's really, really important. But most importantly, to make a plan, take action, and start reporting. You might have committed to net zero, I don't know, but you need to be talking about what you're actually doing rather than just talking about what you have committed to do.